Good morning. My name's Ken Colgan. I'm a staff interpreter at the English booth in the European Parliament, and I'm going to be talking about time zones, how they arose, the differences between them, and some curious facts about them. I've tried to avoid names as much as I can, but I have included one of the now late President of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, which is spelled H-U-G-O-C-H-A-V-E-Z, and there's a couple of US states, Illinois and Wisconsin, and the reasonably well-known English town of Bristol. But apart from that, it should all be very straightforward. And so the speech will begin now. Mr. Chairman, there's nothing more natural than getting off a high-speed train or a long-distance flight and adjusting your watch to the now local time zone. I did it myself this weekend when I went to London on the Eurostar to see the tennis at Wimbledon. I had to put my watch back 1 hour when I arrived in London, and I put it forward an hour when I arrived back in Brussels. If you fly to New York, your watch has to go back 6 hours, and to Sydney in Australia it goes forward 10 hours. But this is all relatively new. Anyone travelling to Sydney in the 19th century, for example, from Britain, would have been a convict and wouldn't have been interested really in the time. Also, timekeeping was so erratic back then, and the conditions were such that ships, which are the only method of long-distance transport, of course, could only leave when the wind and the tide allowed them to do so, not at 9:27, as they do on the new accurate timetables in the 21st century. But in fact, curiously enough, the problem at local level wasn't that there weren't any time zones, it was that there were too many. Time was determined individually by each town and village. It was basically a man who was appointed, and he would go outside at noon, stare up in the air, and when the sun was directly overhead, that would be 12 o'clock. What this meant was that every town and city in the country, I'm using my own country, Britain, as an example, had a slightly different time. The city of Bristol, for example, was 10 minutes behind the capital, London. So anybody who travelled from London to Bristol would have to adjust his or her watch, assuming they had a watch, on arrival. This didn't really cause any problems until there were two things that happened at more or less the same time. First of all, the invention of a more accurate way of keeping time, as watches became more and more precise. And secondly, the development of a mass and rapid and long-distance transport system. I'm talking, of course, about the railways, which began to come in the UK in about the first third of the 19th century, around 1830. Every single station along a railway line had a different time zone, for the reasons that I've already explained. And railway companies became alarmed at the near misses and sometimes accidents which occurred. It became clear that something had to be done. And so what the railways did was standardise the time. And by 1845, all railway companies would use what was known as London time. There was a lot of local opposition to this. Railway companies controlled the time that was used on the railways, of course, but they had no influence over what was used once the passengers had left the station. And so you'd often see a railway station clock with one time on, and if the traveller left the station and went out into the square, he would see on, say, the church tower, a clock saying a different time. And in fact, in the city of Bristol, which I've referred to earlier, there's a clock with 2 minute hands, one set to local Bristol time and the other one set to London time. Eventually, the Parliament legislated that in Britain we would have only one time zone, and that London time would be the time for the whole of the country. This happened in 1880. The United States is a lot bigger than Britain and developed railways at more or less the same time. So of course it faced exactly the same problem, but on a larger scale. Illinois, for example, had 27 different time zones, and Wisconsin 38. The railways knew, therefore, that time had to be standardised, and each company came up with its own standard railway time. A big city, like Chicago, would have 6 large clocks, each indicating the time used by the railway company operating there. Eventually, they went the same way as Britain, and the US was divided into 5 time zones. and this was made the national legal system by Congress in 1918. And a Canadian railway engineer decided that it would be a good idea if the whole world were covered in the same way. And in 1884, delegates from 27 countries met in Washington, D.C., and signed an agreement bringing in the time zone system that's more or less similar to the one which we have today. The system, as I said, is international, it's agreed upon, but it's not mandatory. Countries are free to choose their own time zone. China, for example, is the third largest country in the world, and is entitled, so to speak, to have 5 time zones, and indeed it did have 5 until 1949, but now the whole country runs on Beijing time. India could have 3 time zones, but it too prefers to have just 1. And you may remember that back in 2007, the then president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, decided that the whole country would move back 15 minutes. He claimed that it would be more productive if people woke up in daylight. His political opponent said he simply wanted to have a time system in Venezuela that was different to that of the United States. But since we're talking about time, I have just realized that my time is about up, so I'll end the speech there. Thank you very much.